The rain came down in sheets that October afternoon, the kind of relentless Seattle downpour that turned the cemetery into a watercolor painting where everything bled together. Evelyn Thornwood stood 3 feet from her father's casket, black dress clinging to her frame, and watched water pool in the carved letters of his name. Robert James Thornwood. 68 years reduced to brass letters and a polished box. She was 26 and an orphan now. The mourners clustered under a striped canopy that sagged in the middle, collecting rain like a broken promise. Corporate executives in expensive suits, business partners who'd made fortunes on her father's vision, society women who'd attended charity galas at the Thornwood estate and never once asked about the man behind the checkbook. Catherine Ashford Morrison stood apart from Evie, close enough to appear united in grief, but far enough to avoid actual contact. Kate was 52 and looked 40. Her black Chanel suit immaculate despite the weather, her blonde hair swept into a chignon that hadn't moved once in the wind. She held her phone low against her skirt thumb, moving across the screen in quick, practiced swipes. Evie watched her stepmother check the time, watched her bite back what looked very much like a smile. The pastor droned something about eternal rest and God's mysterious ways, words that meant nothing, because Robert Thornwood had been an atheist who built empires with his hands and trusted spreadsheets more than scripture. He wouldn't have wanted this ceremony, this performance. He would have wanted fishing gear and silence and maybe a cold beer at sunset. August felt like yesterday. The two of them on Lake Washington, rods in the water, not catching anything but not caring either. Robert had looked thin that day, his flannel shirt hanging loose on shoulders that used to fill doorways, but his eyes had been clear when he turned to her. "Remember, Evie Bear, what matters most never shines in store windows." She'd laughed, thinking he meant the lure glinting in the sun. Now she understood he'd meant everything else. The service ended. People filed past murmuring condolences that sounded rehearsed. Evie shook hands she wouldn't remember and accepted embraces from strangers who smelled like expensive perfume and professional sympathy. Kate received her own line of mourners, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief that stayed pristine. Jordan Morrison lingered near his mother, 22 years old and uncomfortable in a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Kate's son, from whatever came before Robert. He caught Evie's eye, once started to move toward her, but Kate's hand shot out and gripped his elbow. She smiled at someone important and pulled Jordan back into her orbit. The crowd thinned. The rain didn't. Evie stood alone at the grave while workers waited at a respectful distance with shovels ready to finish what grief had started. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the last thing her father had touched. A lure he'd been tying the morning he died unfinished, the feathers still scattered across his desk. She dropped it into the grave. It hit the casket with a sound too small to matter. The law office of Whitmore and Associates occupied the 7th floor of a building that smelled like old money and furniture polish. Evie arrived first 3 days after the funeral, wearing the same black dress because she hadn't thought to buy another. The receptionist led her to a conference room with windows overlooking Elliott Bay and a mahogany table that could seat 12. Diana Whitmore was already there, 58, and steel-gray, elegant, sorting documents into careful piles. She'd been the Thornwood family attorney for 40 years, since before Evie was born, and she looked at Evie now with something that might have been pity or might have been apology. "We'll begin when everyone arrives." Kate swept in 20 minutes late, Jordan trailing behind her like a satellite locked in orbit. She air-kissed both of Evie's cheeks, her perfume a cloud of something French and cloying. "Darling, you look exhausted. Are you eating?" Evie said nothing. Kate settled into the chair at the head of the table as if she'd been born to it. Diana broke the wax seal on the envelope containing Robert's last will and testament. The paper crackled in the silence. Kate leaned forward, fingers drumming against the table's edge, a tell she probably didn't know she had. Jordan stared at his phone, not even pretending interest. Diana cleared her throat and began to read. The bulk of the estate went exactly where Evie had known it would go, because Kate had spent 5 years positioning herself for this moment. The Thornwood estate on Lake Washington, $12 million worth of mansion and grounds and imported marble. The stock portfolio, $18 million in carefully curated investments. The cars, the art, the vacation property in Aspen that Robert had visited exactly once. Kate's face remained composed, but her eyes glittered like cut glass catching light. Jordan received the dealership chain, 6 locations across Washington state that generated reliable income and required minimal oversight. He also got the vacation home in Cabo San Lucas, a property Kate had insisted they buy 2 years ago over Robert's objections. Then Diana paused. Her eyes found Evie across the table and held there something unreadable passing across her face. To my daughter, Evelyn Rose Thornwood. I leave the property located at 89 Willowbrook Lane in the township of Ravenswood, Washington, including all structures, land, and contents therein. Kate's laugh cut through the room like breaking crystal. Willowbrook. That old hunting shack. The one that's been condemned for a decade. Diana continued reading as if Kate hadn't spoken. The property is deeded in full, taxes paid through the year 2030, with all maintenance and upkeep costs covered by a separate trust established for this purpose. Evie's hands had gone numb. She stared at the table, at the wood grain that looked like waves frozen mid-crash. That's it. Kate's voice climbed half an octave. He left her a pile of rotting lumber that concludes the distribution of assets. Diana closed the folder. She stood gathering papers that no longer mattered. Miss Thornwood, if you'll stay a moment. Kate rose in a rustle of silk and satisfaction. She paused beside Evie's chair, one manicured hand coming to rest on Evie's shoulder with just enough pressure to feel like a claim of victory. At least you won't have to pay property taxes on something worthless. Small mercies. Jordan followed his mother out without looking back. The door clicked shut behind them with the soft certainty of a vault ceiling. Diana waited until their footsteps faded down the hallway. Then she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single iron key, old and heavy and spotted with rust that no amount of polish could erase. Your father was the sharpest man I ever knew, Evelyn, right up until the end. She set the key on the table between them. He wrote this will 2 weeks ago. His mind was completely clear. Clearer than it had been in years, actually. Then why would he? Diana held up one hand. He told me something when he brought me this document. He said Katie looks at price tags, Evie looks at value, and then he asked me to tell you something if you seemed confused. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Trust him. Go to the house. The drive to Ravenswood took 4 hours through weather that shifted from rain to mist and back again. Evie's Honda Civic rattled over potholes the county had stopped fixing years ago, past towns that existed as single traffic lights and gas stations that looked abandoned even when they weren't. Cell service died somewhere around mile marker 47. The radio faded to static. She'd driven this route 100 times as a child, summers when her mother was still alive and Willowbrook meant adventure instead of inheritance. The house had been new then, or new enough, built by her grandparents in 1998 when lumber was cheap and dreams were still manageable. Her mother Rose had grown up there, had met Robert there during a summer when he'd been working construction to pay for business school. Evie remembered her mother's laugh echoing through those rooms, remembered flower fights in the kitchen and sleeping bags on the porch when the nights were warm enough, remembered her father teaching her to identify birds by their calls, while her mother tended a garden that grew roses in colors that shouldn't have been possible. Then Rose got sick. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the kind that gave you 6 months and took you in 4. Evie had been 10 years old enough to understand death, but not old enough to believe in it. The funeral had been in October, just like Robert's. The rain had fallen just as hard. Robert had kept Willowbrook after Rose died, had brought Evie there every summer until she was 16. Then the trip stopped. He started dating Kate. Everything changed in ways that felt deliberate and wrong, like someone rearranging furniture in the dark. They married in June of 2021, 5 years that felt like 50. Kate had smiled her way into Robert's life with the precision of someone who'd studied the blueprints first. Within 6 months, the weekly phone calls between Robert and Evie became monthly, then quarterly, then just birthday cards with signatures that didn't look quite like his handwriting anymore. The last time Evie had seen her father before that final fishing trip was Christmas 2023. He'd been at the Thornwood estate, surrounded by Kate's friends and Kate's caterers and Kate's vision of what holiday gatherings should look like. He'd pulled Evie aside in the library, whispered that he was tired, that things weren't what they seemed. She'd assumed he meant his health. Now she wondered what else he'd meant. The trees thickened as the road climbed into foothills. Douglas fir and western red cedar crowded close branches, scraping the car's roof like fingers testing for weakness. A deer bolted across the road and Evie slammed the brakes, heart hammering, watching the animal disappear into underbrush. The turnoff to Willowbrook Lane was barely visible, marked by a weathered sign that listed 15 degrees to the left. She took the turn. Gravel crunched under her tires. The lane curved through forest that had reclaimed most of the cleared land, blackberry brambles thick enough to hide entire structures. Then the house came into view, and Evie's breath caught. Condemned was generous. The Victorian structure sagged in the middle like a spine that had given up supporting weight. The roof dipped dangerously between support beams. Windows were boarded with plywood gone gray from weather and rot. The wraparound porch listed to one side, missing railings, and half its floorboards looking like a mouth with teeth knocked out by time. Paint peeled in long strips revealing bare wood underneath that had weathered to the color of old bones. The chimney tilted at an angle that defied physics. Vines strangled the eastern wall, climbing toward windows that would never open again. But the front fence, though old, had been recently mended. Chicken wire stretched between posts that were new enough to still show saw marks. The driveway, while overgrown, had been cleared within the last few months, and the front door, barely visible behind its frame of decay, had a lock that gleamed with fresh oil. Someone had been maintaining this place, recently. Evie cut the engine. Silence rushed in, broken only by crows calling from the tree line and wind moving through branches. She stepped out of the car, and her boots sank into earth that smelled like moss and decomposition. The air carried scents she'd forgotten she remembered: pine sap, wet soil, something sharper underneath like rust or old blood, or just the particular smell of abandonment. She walked toward the porch, testing each step before committing her weight. The wood groaned but held. She reached the front door and pulled out the iron key Diana had given her. A voice behind her made her spin hand, flying to the pepper spray she'd started carrying after moving to the city. "You lost, miss?" The man stood at the edge of the driveway, maybe 75 years old, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better decades and suspenders that held up canvas work pants. He held a double-barrel shotgun broken open over his arm, not threatening, but not exactly welcoming either. His face had the weathered quality of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors, carved by sun and wind into something resembling driftwood. "I own this place." Evie's voice came out steadier than she felt. "My name is Evelyn Thornwood. Robert Thornwood was my father." The man's entire demeanor shifted. The wariness drained from his eyes, replaced by something that might have been shock or grief or recognition. He snapped the shotgun closed and slung it over his shoulder by the strap. "Tommy's girl." He moved closer, squinting in the fading light. "Christ almighty, you've got Rose's eyes and Bill's stubborn chin. I'm Silas. Silas Blackwood. Used to work for your dad back when this place was still standing proud." "You knew him." "Knew him." Silas let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a cough. "I helped him pour the foundation for the shed out back in 1999. Worked every construction job he ran until my back gave out and my hands started shaking too bad to hold a level. He kept me on payroll anyway, told me to watch over this place." Evie felt something shift in her chest. When last? 5 years. $2,000 a month cash to keep the generator running and make sure nobody stripped the copper or set up a meth lab in the basement. He came out here every Thursday like clockwork. Sat on that porch even when it wasn't safe, talked to your mama like she was still here listening. The grief hit her sideways, sudden and sharp enough to steal breath. She grabbed the porch railing and felt it give slightly under her hand. Silas steadied her elbow. "Easy now. Your daddy told me you might come, though. I figured it'd be under different circumstances." He looked up at the house, something complicated crossing his face. "Said if you showed up, I was to tell you he left something. Something that woman don't know exists." "Kate, the one with the smile that don't reach anywhere real." Silas spat into the weeds. "Yeah, her." He moved past Evie and examined the front door lock. "Thing's tricky. Gotta lift the handle while you turn, otherwise the bolt won't catch. Here." He took the key from her hand, demonstrated the motion. The lock clicked, and the door swung inward on hinges that should have screamed, but moved silent as confession. The smell hit first, dust and old paper and something metallic underneath like pennies left in the rain. Evie pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through air thick with particles that danced like snow in summer. The interior was a disaster and a shrine. Furniture sat under white sheets gone gray with time shapes that could have been couches or caskets or nothing at all. Wallpaper peeled in long strips that curled away from the walls like skin after a sunburn. Bird nests crowded the corners where ceiling met wall, twigs and feathers marking territory claimed by something other than memory. But there were clean spots. A path through the dust on the floor, boot prints that looked recent. The kitchen doorway showed scrub marks where someone had wiped down the frame. And above the fireplace in what used to be the living room hung a portrait of her father, the canvas slashed diagonally but carefully reframed, the damage preserved rather than hidden. Evie moved deeper into the house. The floorboards creaked but held. She avoided the soft spots where water damage had made the wood spongy and treacherous. Behind her she heard Silas moving toward the back of the house. Generators round back. Still got fuel. Let me fire her up before you go breaking your neck in the dark. She stood in the living room while Silas's footsteps faded. The furniture under sheets formed strange geometries in the flashlight beam. She pulled back the nearest cover and found her mother's rocking chair, the one Rose had sat in every evening to read or knit or just watch the sun set through windows that overlooked gardens now reclaimed by wilderness. Evie sank into the chair, and it held her weight solid despite everything. She set her phone on the armrest, and the light angled upward, illuminating the ceiling where someone had painted stars in glow-in-the-dark paint that had long since lost its glow. Her mother had done that. One summer when Evie was 7 and terrified of the dark. Rose had spent 3 nights on a ladder mapping constellations from memory and imagination until the ceiling became a sky that never changed, never left, never stopped watching over her daughter. The lights flickered once, twice. Then the chandelier overhead buzzed to life with a dim yellow glow that turned the dust motes into tiny planets orbiting nothing. The house groaned as power flowed through wiring that probably shouldn't still work. Silas returned, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag that had started some other color. She'll hold for a few hours. After that you'll need to refuel or let her rest. Thank you. Evie stood suddenly aware of how small she felt in this room, in this house, in this inheritance that made no sense. Why did he keep coming here? Silas moved to the mantel, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he picked up something Evie hadn't noticed in the dark. A red envelope. Her name written across it in her father's blocky handwriting, the letters pressed deep enough into the paper to leave shadows. Probably for this. He handed it to her. Said you'd know what it meant. Said you'd look closer than most people do. The envelope wasn't sealed. Evie slid out a single index card, the kind her father used for everything from grocery lists to million-dollar deals. His handwriting covered both sides in the careful print of someone who'd learned to write before computers made it optional. The front read, "Sweetheart Katie sees price tags. Your mama saw hearts. This house holds our beginning and my end. Look where your mother's soul lived happiest." Evie turned the card over. The back held coordinates and a date, October 1st, 2026. 6 days before he died. Her hands started shaking. She read the words again, searching for meaning in the spaces between letters. Her mother's soul. Where she'd lived happiest. The garden. That had to be it. Rose had spent every spare moment tending roses that bloomed in impossible colors. Hybrids she'd created through patience and care, and something that looked like magic when you were 8 years old. But the coordinates didn't point outside. They pointed here. Evie turned slowly, looking at the room with new eyes. The rocking chair, the painted stars, the portrait above the mantel. Where her mother's soul lived happiest. This room, the living room, where Rose had rocked her daughter to sleep, where the family had gathered on winter evenings when the rain made going outside impossible, where her mother had laughed and lived and been happy before sickness stole those options. Evie knelt on the floor beside the rocking chair. The rug underneath had been Persian, once beautiful and expensive, but moths and time had reduced it to threads barely holding together. She grabbed the edge and pulled. The rug came up in a cloud of dust that made her cough. Underneath, the floorboards ran in a different pattern than the rest of the room. Not vertical planks, but herringbone, the wood fitted together in precise angles that required skill and time and purpose. Right in the center sat a board with a circular indentation. Not a knot in the wood. Too perfect for that. Too deliberate. "Silas, do you have a crowbar?" The old man stepped closer, peering down at the floor. His breath caught. "Don't need one. That's a puzzle latch. Your daddy loved his puzzles. Drove your mama crazy when he'd spend hours figuring out some brain teaser instead of fixing the actual problems." "How does it work?" "Hook your finger in. Try pushing, pulling, twisting. One of them will." Evie pressed her index finger into the hole and twisted clockwise. The board clicked. The sound echoed through the floor like a lock tumbler falling into place. Then a mechanical thunk vibrated up through her knees loud enough to make them both jump. The entire center section of the floor lifted on hydraulic hinges that hissed and wheezed but moved smooth as intention. A 3-foot square opened up, revealing darkness underneath, and the top rungs of a ladder descending into nothing. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of concrete and filtered atmosphere and something else. Something that didn't belong in a condemned house. The scent of electronics running, of climate control maintaining exact temperatures, of money. Silas whistled low. "Well, I'll be triple damned. Reckon that's where your inheritance really sits, Miss Thornwood." Evie leaned over the opening. Her phone's flashlight barely penetrated the darkness below, but she could make out the ladder running straight down at least 20 feet. Maybe 30. Professional construction, not something cobbled together with spare lumber and hope. "I'm going down." Silas grabbed a work lamp from somewhere, clicked it on, and handed it to her. "Light switch should be on the right wall about head height. If there's power down there, it'll be on a separate system from the house generator." The ladder rungs were cold, even through her shirt. Evie descended slowly, testing each step, the work lamp hanging from a strap around her wrist and swinging with each movement. The walls were concrete, smooth and recent, the kind of construction that cost serious money and required serious planning. 20 rungs down, 30. The square of light from the living room above shrank to the size of a postage stamp, barely visible. Her foot hit solid ground, concrete floor perfectly level. She swept the lamp around, found the wall, found the switch exactly where Silas said it would be. She flipped it. The room blazed to life in stages as fluorescent lights flickered on one by one, revealing a space that shouldn't exist under a condemned house in the middle of nowhere. The vault was massive, easily 1,000 square feet. The walls were reinforced concrete at least 18 inches thick, the kind used for storm shelters and bank vaults and places designed to outlast whatever happened on the surface. Ventilation systems hummed in the ceiling, modern HEPA filters, moving air through ducts that led somewhere else, somewhere with power and purpose. The left wall held floor-to-ceiling industrial shelving stacked with heavy plastic bins. Evie moved toward them like a sleepwalker, her hands shaking as she popped the lid on the first container. Cash. Vacuum-sealed bricks of $100 bills, stacked with the precision of someone who'd spent hours making sure everything fit perfectly. She pulled one brick out. It was heavy, substantial, real. The second bin held more cash. The third held gold bars wrapped in protective cloth, each one stamped with marks from the Perth Mint. The fourth held her mother's jewelry. The sapphire necklace Kate had claimed was lost during a move. The diamond brooch Evie had worn to senior prom. Her grandmother's wedding ring that was supposed to have been sold to pay for Rose's medical bills. Everything Kate said had vanished. Everything Evie thought was gone forever. All here, all carefully preserved and waiting. The right wall held filing cabinets, dozens of them, each one labeled with dates and names and categories that made no immediate sense. The center of the room held a massive glass and steel desk with 3 monitors sitting dormant in sleep mode, a leather office chair that looked like it cost more than her car, a keyboard, a mouse, a small silver thumb drive sitting next to a note that read, "For Evie. Biometric scan required." She sat in the chair because standing felt impossible. Her legs had stopped working somewhere between the third bin of cash and the realization that her father had built this place, had spent years filling it, had left it all for her while giving Kate the mansion and the stocks and all the things that looked valuable but apparently weren't. The computer monitors woke when she touched the mouse. A prompt appeared on the center screen, "Place thumb on scanner." She pressed her thumb to the reader built into the desk's surface. The system beeped twice, then access granted. "Welcome, Evelyn." A video window opened automatically. Her father's face filled the screen close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the way his hair had gone completely white in the months before he died. He looked thin, exhausted, but his eyes blazed with the kind of intensity she remembered from her childhood, from before Kate, from when he'd been the kind of man who could will entire buildings into existence through sheer determination. "Evie." His voice was rough, like he'd been coughing or crying or both. "If you're seeing this, then the vultures have picked the bones clean, and Kate thinks she's won. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I couldn't risk her finding out." He leaned back in the chair. The same chair Evie sat in now. This same room. Your stepmother isn't just a gold digger, sweetheart. She's a criminal. A corporate parasite. About 3 years ago, December 2023, I found out she was working with Hartfield Industries, my biggest competitor. She was feeding them inside information using my health issues to set up short sells on Thornwood Corporation stock. She was betting on my death to make herself a fortune. Evie's hands gripped the armrests hard enough to hurt. And Jordan? Robert's expression shifted to something like pity. Jordan's been laundering money through the dealerships for the last 2 years. Sports betting rings out of Nevada. He owes someone named Vargas almost $200,000. I have the wire transfers, the offshore accounts, everything. The video. Robert rubbed his face with both hands. I couldn't divorce her. The prenup has a clause Kate insisted on. If I file for divorce, she gets 50% of everything immediately. She'd have triggered it the moment she saw paperwork. Would have frozen the company, destroyed what we built, taken your inheritance before the ink was dry on the decree. So I played the fool, let her think she was winning, let her isolate me from you, from everyone who mattered. And while she was busy measuring drapes for the mansion and planning how to spend my money, I was moving the foundation right out from under her feet. He smiled. It was terrifying and beautiful, and the most Robert thing Evie had ever seen. Everything I left her in that will, it's garbage dressed up as gold. The Thornwood estate has a $15 million mortgage I took out 6 months ago. The balloon payment comes due 30 days after my death. The stock portfolio is worthless preferred shares in shell companies I emptied and dissolved. The joint accounts contain about $400,000, most of it Kate's credit card debt. But you, sweetheart, you have this. He gestured at the room around him. The liquid cash in those bins is $50 million. Every cent taxed and legal and untraceable. The gold is worth another $8 million at current market rates. Your mother's jewelry. The pieces Kate stole and sold off over the years, I bought them all back through private dealers. Robert leaned toward the camera. But more important than the money, you have the files in those cabinets. Evidence of Kate's insider trading, Jordan's money laundering, the bribes their associates took, the fraud they committed. Everything you need to bury them if you choose to. He paused. When she stopped the video later to really think about it, Evie would realize this pause lasted exactly 7 seconds. Time for her father to decide what came next. Time for him to choose his final words. The will I left gives Kate the shell, the pretty things that look valuable but aren't. She'll realize soon enough, but by then you'll be ready. She'll come for Willowbrook. She'll think it's worthless land she can buy cheap and develop. She'll see the aquifer underneath and start making deals with water companies. She'll show her hand because greed always does. And when she comes, you'll have everything you need to fight back. Robert's face softened. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Your mama and I bought this land with $200 and a dream. We built Willowbrook with our own hands, every beam and board and nail. We were happy here, Evie. Happier than I ever was in that mansion on the lake. Happier than I've been in the last 5 years combined. I'm not leaving you nothing, sweetheart. I'm leaving you everything that matters. The money to fight, the truth to wield, and the home where love still lives in the walls. He reached toward the camera. His hand filled the screen for a moment, then the image froze. Evie sat in the silence of the vault for a long time. The ventilation system hummed, the fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere above her, in the wreck of a house that Kate thought was worthless, Silas probably wondered if she'd fallen or gotten lost, or just decided to stay down here forever. She stood on legs that felt like water and moved to the filing cabinets. The first drawer held folders labeled by month and year. She pulled December 2023 and opened it. Email printouts. Kate's personal account communicating with someone at Hartfield Industries. Details about Thornwood Corporation's upcoming property acquisitions. Inside information that could move millions in stock value. All signed with Kate's name, her email, her digital fingerprint, all over evidence that would send her to federal prison. The next folder held Jordan's bank records, wire transfers to offshore accounts, deposits that didn't match any legitimate income, withdrawals that corresponded exactly to payments made to various Las Vegas sports books. The next folder held something that made Evie's blood freeze. Marriage certificate. Catherine Ashford to Marcus Andrew Vale, June 15, 2018, Las Vegas, Nevada. She flipped through the papers. Hotel receipts. Photos of Kate and a man Evie didn't recognize, both of them dressed in wedding clothes in front of a chapel that advertised quickie ceremonies for $50. A copy of the marriage license. A copy of the certificate. No divorce decree. Evie checked the date again. June 2018. Kate had married Robert in June 2021. 3 years later. If there was no divorce, if Kate was still married to Marcus Vale when she married Robert, then the marriage was void. Robert and Kate were never legally married. Everything the will left to my wife would go to no one because there was no wife. The estate would default to intestate succession. Everything would go to Robert's only child. Everything would come to Evie. She closed the folder with hands that had stopped shaking and started burning instead. Her father had known, had found this, had spent 3 years quietly documenting every lie, every theft, every betrayal, had built this vault to hold the truth the same way he'd built Willowbrook to hold love. The next drawer held folders labeled with her mother's name, Rose Thornwood, personal papers, medical records, and underneath all of it, a wooden box wrapped in a ribbon that Rose had tied 20 years ago. Evie lifted the box carefully. It was cedar carved with roses along the edges, the kind of craftsmanship that took time and patience and hands that weren't afraid of small details. She recognized it immediately. Her mother's hope chest, the one that used to sit at the foot of her parents' bed. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, lay Rose's wedding dress. Simple cream silk tea-length, the kind of dress a woman bought when she was marrying for love instead of show. Underneath that, bundled letters tied with kitchen twine, Rose's handwriting on the envelopes. Letters to Robert written before they were married, when they were still just 2 kids who'd found each other in a town too small to hold their dreams. And underneath that, a leather-bound journal. No lock, no secrets. Just Rose's daily thoughts from 1998 until 2010, the year she died. Evie opened to a random page. May 2009. Her mother's handwriting flowed across the page in loops and curves that looked like music frozen mid-song. The doctors told me today. Pancreatic, stage 4. 6 months if I'm lucky, 4 if I'm not. I haven't told Robert yet. I haven't told Evie. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that her mother is dying? How do you teach her to live when you're learning to leave? But I'm writing this because I want her to know someday when she's old enough to understand. I want her to know that Willowbrook isn't just a house. It's where Robert and I learned that wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with mornings watching sunrise together with his laugh, when I burned dinner with Evie's tiny hands, helping me plant roses that will outlive us both. The entry continued for 3 more pages. Instructions for Robert on how to raise their daughter. Wishes for Evie's future. Hopes and fears, and the kind of raw honesty that only comes when you know your time is finite and you need to say everything before the chance disappears. Evie read until her vision blurred, read until she couldn't anymore. Then she closed the journal and held it against her chest and felt grief and rage, and something else crashed through her in waves that threatened to pull her under. Her father hadn't just left her money. He'd left her the truth about her mother, about their marriage, about what they'd built here before cancer and Kate and corporate empire destroyed it all. He'd left her proof that love was real even when it ended, that home was a feeling before it was a structure, that what you build with your hands and heart outlasts what you buy with your wallet. Footsteps on the ladder made her look up. Silas descended carefully, his work boots finding each rung with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime climbing things that shouldn't be climbed. "You okay down here? Sun's setting. Gets cold once the generator runs dry." Evie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I found everything. Figured you might." Silas looked around the vault, not surprised, not shocked, just nodding like this confirmed something he'd suspected for years. "Your daddy was methodical. When he wanted something done right, he took his time and did it proper. How long have you known about this? Built it myself." "Well, me and a crew Robert brought in from California. Sworn to secrecy, paid in cash, the whole 9 yards. Started in 2022, finished summer of 2024. He'd come down here every Thursday, work on his files, organize everything just so." "And you never told Kate?" Silas's expression hardened. "That woman never asked me nothing but to stay clear of the house. Said I made her nervous having an old man with a gun hanging around. Robert told me to keep my head down and my mouth shut. Said when the time came you'd find this and you'd understand." "I understand." Evie stood her legs steady now, her hands no longer shaking. "I understand everything. What are you going to do? Fight. The word came out harder than she intended, sharper. Kate thinks she won. She thinks I'm some grief-stricken kid who'll sell her the land for pennies and disappear. She's wrong. Silas grinned, and for a moment Evie saw the young man. He must have been the kind who built things that lasted and didn't back down when pressure came calling. That's Tommy's daughter talking. Your mama would be proud. A sound from above made them both freeze. An engine, tires on gravel, headlights cutting through the dark and sweeping across windows that shouldn't show light because the house was supposed to be empty. Someone was here. Silas moved to the ladder. You expecting company? Number Evie grabbed the thumb drive from the desk, shoved it in her pocket, and followed Silas up. They climbed fast, emerged into the living room just as headlights went dark outside. A truck door slammed, footsteps on the porch, then a knock, polite and careful, nothing threatening about it. Silas had his shotgun in his hands before Evie could blink. He moved to the window, peered through a gap in the boards, then relaxed slightly. It's that architect your daddy hired, Mercer. Told him to come by if you showed up. Evie moved to the door, her heart still hammering, and pulled it open. The man on the porch was maybe 35, wearing jeans and a flannel jacket that had seen honest work. Dark hair curled over his collar, uncut for a while, but intentionally so. He had carpenter's hands and eyes that looked like they'd learned to notice details most people missed. A Ford F-150 sat in the driveway behind him, vintage, but maintained the kind of truck someone kept running because they valued the work more than the status. Evelyn Thornwood. His voice matched his appearance, steady, no nonsense, the kind of tone that inspired trust without asking for it. I'm Nathaniel Mercer. Friends call me Nate. Your father hired me 6 months ago. To do what to save this house? To save this? He gestured at Willowbrook like it was a patient on life support instead of a structure halfway to collapse. Your dad showed me the bones underneath all this rot. Showed me the blueprints from when your grandparents built it. Made me promise that when you came I'd help you see what he saw. Which was? Nate smiled. It wasn't a salesman's smile or a contractor's smile. It was the smile of someone who understood exactly what kind of grief Evie was carrying and wasn't going to make it worse by pretending otherwise. A home worth fighting for. He pulled a rolled set of papers from inside his jacket. Plans for complete restoration. Every detail mapped out. Every cost calculated. He told me to give you these and tell you, this house saved me and Rose. It'll save you too. Evie took the blueprints. They were heavy professional, the kind of documentation that took months to create. Her father's handwriting filled the margins with notes and specifications and instructions that read like love letters to a building. Why would he think I need saving? Nate's expression shifted to something gentler. Because he knew what Kate would do to you, what she'd take, what she'd destroy. And he wanted you to have a place she could never touch, a foundation she could never shake. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The first drops of rain hit the roof with sounds like bullets finding targets. The three of them stood in the doorway of Willowbrook, Evie holding blueprints. Silas holding his shotgun, Nate holding his ground, and looked out at the forest going dark as the storm rolled in. There's more. Nate's voice cut through the rain. Your father showed me what's underneath. He cleared his throat. He told me if you found it, you'd need help protecting it. And he asked me to stick around if you wanted the company. Evie looked at this stranger, who apparently wasn't a stranger, who her father had trusted, who stood in the rain talking about saving houses like it mattered more than money. Come inside. She stepped back, held the door open. We need to talk about what happens next. The three of them moved into the living room. Silas closed the hatch to the vault and covered it with the rug again. Nate set down a waterproof bag that clinked with tools and possibility. Evie spread the blueprints across her mother's old dining table and studied her father's plans. Willowbrook could be beautiful again. The rot could be cut away. The foundation could be reinforced. The roof could hold weather instead of surrendering to it. Windows could open. Gardens could grow. Life could happen here the way it used to, the way Rose and Robert intended before everything went sideways. But first Kate would come. She'd come with lawyers and demolition orders and every weapon money could buy. She'd come to claim the land, to exploit the aquifer, to turn Evie's inheritance into Kate's profit margin, and Evie would be ready. They planned until midnight, the three of them mapping strategy like generals before a war that hadn't started yet but was already inevitable. Silas knew every inch of the property, every access road, every weak point in the fence line. Nate knew construction law and historical preservation statutes and how to turn a condemned building into a protected landmark with the right paperwork and the right arguments. Evie knew the truth, and truth her father had taught her was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. When Silas finally left for his cabin up the ridge and Nate headed back to town, Evie stood alone in Willowbrook for the first time since childhood. The house creaked and settled around her. The generator hummed its mechanical lullaby. Rain hammered the roof without breaking through. She went down to the vault one more time, sat at her father's desk, looked at the monitors that held his final message frozen on his face, reaching toward the camera. "I won't let her win, Dad." The words came out like a promise and a prayer and a declaration of war all at once. "I'll fight for this, for Willowbrook, for Mom's memory, for everything you built." The ventilation system hummed its agreement. The lights flickered but held. Somewhere above her in rooms she'd slept in as a child, the ghosts of better days waited to see what came next. Evie pulled Rose's journal from where she'd left it opened to the last entry her mother ever wrote. September 2010, 2 weeks before Rose died. The handwriting was shaky but determined, every letter a small victory against the morphine and the pain and the cancer eating her alive. "Evie, my darling girl, by the time you read this you'll be grown. You'll have faced things I couldn't protect you from. You'll have learned that life takes more than it gives, and the trick is being grateful for the giving anyway. Willowbrook is yours now, or it will be someday. Your father will make sure of it. This house is where we learned that the only wealth that matters is the kind you can't put in a vault. Love, purpose, roots deep enough to weather any storm. Build your life here if you choose. Build it somewhere else if that's what calls to you. But remember, home isn't where you live. It's where you're brave enough to love despite knowing you might lose everything." Evie closed the journal. She turned off the monitors. She climbed the ladder back into the living room and stood in the doorway looking out at rain that showed no signs of stopping. Kate thought she'd won. Kate thought Evie was broken and helpless and too grief-stricken to fight. Kate was wrong about all of it. Jordan Morrison arrived on a Tuesday morning when frost still clung to the blackberry brambles and the sun hadn't burned through the mist rising from the forest floor. His yellow Porsche Cayenne looked obscene against the backdrop of Willowbrook's decay, a chrome and leather advertisement for wealth that didn't understand the difference between cost and value. Evie was on the porch with Silas cataloging structural damage for Nate's crew. She set down her clipboard and watched Jordan navigate potholes that scraped his undercarriage with sounds like violence. He stepped out wearing white linen that belonged in Malibu, not rural Washington in November. Mud splattered his designer sneakers before he made it 3 steps. He pulled a folder from his passenger seat and approached with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. "Evie." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You look rough. This place treating you okay?" "What do you want, Jordan?" He opened the folder, pulled out a document printed on expensive letterhead. "Mom and I talked. We feel bad about how the will shook out. It's not right, Dad, leaving you with this liability." "Liability?" The word hung in the cold air like an accusation. "So we want to help." He held out the paper. "Quit claim deed. We'll take the property off your hands, handle the demolition costs, deal with the county. 50,000 cash. You can walk away, start fresh somewhere that doesn't require a tetanus shot." Evie took the paper. "Read it carefully." The deed transfer was straightforward enough, but the legal description of the property included subsurface rights, water rights, mineral rights, everything beneath the rot and the weeds. "You're planning to develop this." Her voice came out flat, stating fact rather than asking permission. Jordan's smile flickered. "We're planning to mitigate an eyesore. Maybe turn it into a nature preserve, something the county can use. Tax write-off for Mom. The aquifer underneath. The water rights Kate already promised to Montana Springs. 50,000 for land that would generate $8 million in extraction fees over 20 years. Evie handed the paper back. "No." His composure cracked just enough to show the panic beneath. "Be reasonable. This place is condemned. The county's going to force demolition anyway. You'll end up with fines you can't pay and a tax burden that'll bankrupt you. Then I'll deal with those problems when they come." She crossed her arms. "Why does Kate need this so badly, Jordan? Why the rush?" His eyes darted to Silas, then back to Evie. "There's no rush. We're just trying to... You mentioned water rights in the deed. Most people wouldn't think to include those in a property transfer for a teardown. Most people wouldn't know Ravenswood sits on one of the largest natural aquifers in the county. Jordan's face went pale. He took a step back. How did you Dad knew everything? Evie moved closer, close enough to see sweat beading on Jordan's forehead despite the cold. He knew about Montana Springs, about the preliminary contract, about the $8 million Kate borrowed against future water rights she doesn't actually own yet. We're not. He also knew about Vargas. The name came out quiet surgical. About the gambling debts. About the money you've been washing through the dealerships to cover your losses. Jordan stumbled backward like she'd hit him. His expensive shoes caught on a tree root and he nearly fell. When he spoke, his voice cracked somewhere between anger and terror. You're bluffing. You don't know anything. $180,000. Due in 13 days. Your mother promised you'd have it by then, didn't she? Told you the inheritance would cover everything? Jordan's whole body started shaking. He looked at the house at Silas with his perpetual shotgun at Evie standing her ground on a porch that shouldn't hold weight but did anyway. Mom said this would be easy. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She said you'd take the money and leave. She said you wouldn't fight. Your mother lied to you about a lot of things, Jordan. The words came out gentler than Evie intended. You're not the villain here. You're just another person she used. I need this money. Desperation bled through every syllable. Vargas isn't the kind of guy who gives extensions, then testify against her. Help me prove what she's done. I can protect you from Kate. I can't protect you from federal money laundering charges. Jordan stared at her like she'd started speaking a language he'd never learned. Then he turned and ran for his Porsche, slipping in mud, nearly falling twice. The engine roared to life. He reversed so hard the tires spun gravel like bullets. Evie watched until the yellow vehicle disappeared into the tree line. Silas spat tobacco juice into the weeds. That boy's more scared of his mama than he is of the law. That's a problem. He'll come around. Or he won't. Either way, Kate's next move just got harder. 3 days later, the county sheriff arrived with a demolition crew and a bulldozer that left diesel fumes hanging in the November air like industrial fog. Kate stepped out of a black Lincoln Continental wearing Chanel and certainty her heels sinking into mud, she pretended not to notice. Diana Whitmore's Mercedes pulled in right behind them, the lawyer's timing so perfect it had to be coordinated. She emerged with a briefcase and an expression that could cut glass. The sheriff, Deputy Martinez, according to his name tag, approached Evie with paperwork that looked official enough to be dangerous. Ma'am, I have a demolition order signed by Judge Wilcox. Structure's been deemed an immediate public safety hazard. You've got 10 minutes to clear any personal belongings before the equipment moves in. Kate watched from beside the bulldozer, arms crossed, victory written across her face like a signature on a check she'd already cashed. Diana's voice cut through the morning cold. Deputy Martinez, before you proceed, I'm serving you with an emergency injunction from the state Supreme Court. She handed him papers that made his expression shift from certainty to confusion. The structure at 89 Willowbrook Lane has been petitioned for historical landmark status. Washington state preservation law requires a minimum 180-day assessment period before any demolition can proceed on properties built before 1950. That house wasn't built until the 90s. Kate's voice climbed half an octave. The original foundation dates to 1924. Diana pulled out photographs, property records, courthouse filings that showed a history Kate hadn't bothered to research. The Victorian structure was built on the site of the original Blackwood homestead. The foundation stones are still visible in the basement. That makes this property eligible for protection under the Heritage Preservation Act. This is ridiculous. Kate marched toward Diana, mud-ruining shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. This is a delay tactic. That shack is rotting from the inside out. Then the assessment will confirm that, and demolition can proceed in 6 months. Diana's smile could have frozen water. Unless, of course, the Historical Society determines the structure has cultural significance. Then we're looking at a much longer process. The sheriff looked at the injunction, looked at his demolition order, looked at the 2 lawyers facing off like gunslingers at noon. I'm going to need to verify this with the county attorney. Please do. Diana gestured to her car. I'll wait. Kate's composure finally shattered. She closed the distance between herself and Evie in 3 sharp strides, grabbed Evie's arm hard enough to leave marks, and pulled her away from the others. Her voice dropped to a hiss meant only for Evie's ears. You think you're clever. You think hiring a lawyer and playing preservation games will stop me. I have millions, Evelyn. I have connections. I can bury you in legal fees before spring." Evie met her stepmother's eyes without flinching. "You don't have millions, you have debt. The mansion's in foreclosure, your stocks are worthless, and in about 3 weeks you're going to be broke." Kate's grip loosened. Color drained from her face like water from a cracked basin. "I know about the balloon payment, about the shell companies, about Montana Springs and the contract you can't fulfill because you don't own the water rights." How Kate's voice caught. "Who told you Dad told me? Everything. Every lie you told. Every dollar you stole. Every person you used." Kate took a step backward, her heels catching in mud that pulled at her like quicksand. "That's impossible. He didn't know. He couldn't have asked Marcus Vale." The name hit Kate like a bullet. "See if he remembers your wedding in Reno. See if he remembers never signing divorce papers." Kate's face went from pale to gray. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. For 5 seconds, Evie counted Catherine Morrison stood frozen like a program that had encountered an error it couldn't process. Then she turned and ran for her Lincoln. Not walking, actually running in heels through mud that destroyed what was left of her expensive clothes. She screamed something at the sheriff at the bulldozer operator commands that nobody followed because they'd already seen Diana's injunction and nobody wanted to end up on the wrong side of a state Supreme Court order. The Lincoln reversed hard enough to clip a drainage ditch. Kate didn't slow down. She disappeared down Willowbrook Lane doing twice the safe speed, leaving only exhaust and the smell of burning rubber. Diana walked over, adjusting her glasses. "What did you say to her?" "The truth. It's more effective than people think." The demolition crew packed up. The sheriff apologized for the inconvenience. Within an hour, Willowbrook Lane was quiet again, except for the crows and the wind, and Silas whistling something that sounded like a victory march. Nate's truck arrived that afternoon with lumber and tools and a crew of 3 men who looked at Willowbrook like it was a patient worth saving. They set up work lights and generators started stripping away the rot to expose the solid bones underneath. Evie moved her few belongings into the one upstairs bedroom that still had intact floorboards. She slept on a camping cot while saws screamed downstairs and the house slowly transformed from corpse to resurrection. The work revealed secrets. Behind water-damaged drywall they found the original wainscoting hand-carved oak that someone had covered over in the 70s. Under 3 layers of linoleum, they discovered hardwood floors that needed refinishing but were structurally sound. In the attic, they found a steamer trunk filled with photographs from 1924 images of the Blackwood family building their homestead with horses and hand tools and determination that predated modern machinery. Silas identified his grandfather in one photo, a young man, maybe 25, standing beside a foundation that would eventually become the house where his grandson now stood guard. "That's him." Silas touched the photograph with fingers that trembled just slightly. "Edgar Blackwood. Died in 1952. Left this place to my daddy, who sold it to your grandparents in 1997 when he couldn't afford the property taxes anymore." "Did you know them?" "My grandparents met them once. Your grandma made the best blackberry pie in 3 counties. Your grandpa had hands like iron and a laugh that could shake rafters. They built additions onto Edgar's foundation, turned a homestead into something that could hold a family." Nate studied the photographs, comparing them to the blueprints Robert had commissioned. "We can restore this. Not just fix it, actually bring it back to what it was meant to be. But it's going to take time and money. I have both." Evie thought about the vault beneath her feet, about $50 million in cash that Kate didn't know existed. "Start with the foundation. Make it solid. Everything else can come after." The romance developed in margins too small for Evie to notice until she was already caught. Nate worked alongside his crew, hands dirty, back bent over problems that required both strength and precision. He explained load-bearing walls and water damage and historical preservation techniques with a patience that never felt condescending. He brought coffee at dawn, shared lunches on the porch when the weather cooperated, asked about her mother, about Rose's garden plans they'd found in the attic, about whether Evie wanted to recreate them or create something new. "You don't have to keep your mother's garden exactly as it was." Nate unrolled drawings Rose had sketched in 1999, detailed plans for rose beds and walking paths, and a small pond that was never built. "You could honor her memory by building something that reflects who you are now." "I don't know who I am now." "Then maybe the garden can help you figure it out." He never pushed, never made assumptions. When Evie's grief came in waves that knocked her sideways in the middle of measuring kitchen cabinets or selecting paint colors, Nate simply handed her space and waited. His own father had died when Nate was 12. Car accident, sudden and violent, the kind of loss that created a before and after, with no bridge between them. He understood that grief wasn't linear, and healing didn't follow schedules. Evie found herself looking for him when he wasn't there. Found herself listening for his truck in the mornings. Found herself noticing the way sawdust caught in his hair, or how his hands moved with absolute certainty when he was working with wood. It terrified her, this small tenderness growing in spaces Kate had tried to hollow out. The first week of December brought news that crashed through Willowbrook like a battering ram. Silas heard it from his cousin, who worked at the county assessor's office. Diana confirmed it with phone calls to contacts in Seattle's financial district. The Thornwood estate was in foreclosure. The bank had filed papers. The $15 million balloon payment Robert had structured to come due 30 days after his death had passed its deadline. The bank had given Kate a 2-week grace period that expired December 15th. She had 8 days to satisfy the debt or lose the property. The stocks Kate thought were worth $18 million had been liquidated by her brokers, only to discover they were preferred shares in dissolved shell companies. Worthless paper. The joint bank accounts she'd raided showed a negative balance once her credit card charges cleared. Kate was hemorrhaging money she didn't have, watching her empire collapse in real time. Jordan called Evie's cell phone 3 times that day. She didn't answer. The 4th time she picked up. His voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "We're broke. Mom's been lying about everything. The stocks are worthless. The bank accounts are empty. She took out loans I didn't know about, credit cards, everything. We're not just broke. We're negative millions." "Where's Kate now?" "Locked in her bedroom. Won't come out. Won't talk to anyone. She just keeps saying your name like a curse." Evie sat on the porch steps, phone pressed to her ear, watching Nate's crew work on replacing the rotten support beams. "Jordan, did your mother ever mention being married before my father?" Silence stretched for 10 heartbeats. Then, "What did she ever talk about someone named Marcus Vale?" "Num. I don't. Who is that?" "Your mother's husband. They married in 2018. No divorce. Which means her marriage to my father was void." More silence. When Jordan spoke again, his voice had changed. Smaller. Younger. Like he'd regressed to a child who'd just learned Santa Claus was a lie told by people who should have known better. "She lied about that too. She lied about everything. But you already knew that, didn't you?" I thought Jordan's breath caught. I thought she loved him. My stepdad. I thought maybe she'd finally found something real. She found money. Love was never part of the equation. The call ended without goodbyes. Evie sat watching clouds move across the sky and wondered if Kate had ever loved anyone, or if greed had burned out that capacity so long ago there wasn't even scar tissue left to mark where the wound had been. Diana found Marcus Vale in Reno through a private investigator who specialized in tracking people who didn't want to be found. Marcus worked at a community center on the south side of the city counseling gambling addicts who came through programs funded by the same casinos that had destroyed them in the first place. Evie and Diana flew out on a Wednesday morning, caught a cab from the airport that smelled like cigarette smoke and regret, and waited in the community center's lobby until Marcus's shift ended. He looked older than 54. The kind of older that came from hard living and harder lessons from nights spent losing more than money and mornings spent trying to remember why sobriety mattered. But his eyes were clear, and his handshake was firm when Diana introduced them. "You look like your father." Marcus studied Evie's face like he was searching for proof of something he'd already decided. Same eyes, same stubborn jaw. They sat in his office, a converted supply closet, with a desk and 2 chairs and motivational posters about recovery that looked like they'd been printed in 1987. Diana explained the situation. Kate's bigamy, the void marriage, the inheritance that hinged on whether Marcus would testify. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Diana finished, he leaned back in his chair until it creaked. "Met Katie in Atlantic City, June 2018. I was on a 3-day losing streak and she was bartending at a casino where the drinks were free and the advice was terrible." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We were both broke, both desperate, both convinced we deserved better than what we'd gotten." They flew to Vegas that night, got married at one of those chapels that doesn't ask questions if you've got $50 and a pulse. Honeymoon was a buffet at the Flamingo and a room at Circus Circus that smelled like mold. Katie kept talking about the big score, the opportunity that was coming. She just needed time to set it up. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. Paid me $50,000 in December. Said she'd found her Mark some wealthy widower in Seattle. Told me to disappear, that she'd handle the divorce paperwork, that I should take the money and rebuild somewhere nobody knew my name. Did you ever sign papers? Never saw papers. Assumed she forged them. Katie was good at paperwork. Good at making things look legitimate when they weren't. Diana pulled out documents. Your marriage to Catherine is still legal. There's no divorce record in Nevada, California, Oregon, or Washington. She committed bigamy when she married Robert Thornwood. Marcus studied the marriage certificate, his own signature from 7 years ago, the proof that he was still legally bound to a woman who'd paid him to vanish. Yeah, that sounds like something Katie would do. Will you testify? Evie leaned forward. In Seattle, in front of a judge. Your father contacted me back in June. Marcus opened his desk drawer, pulled out a letter on Thornwood Corporation letterhead. He'd tracked me down, explained what Katie had done, asked if I'd be willing to help set things right. I told him yes. Figured I owed him that much for unknowingly helping her run the con. Why didn't he use this information himself? He was dying. Marcus's voice softened. He told me he didn't have time for a legal battle, said he was arranging things so his daughter would have the weapons she needed when the time came. Said you were tougher than Katie thought and smarter than she could imagine. Evie felt tears burning behind her eyes. She blinked them back. I'll testify. Marcus folded the letter and slid it back into his drawer. Not for revenge, not even for justice. For your dad. He was a good man who got tangled up with someone who only knows how to take. Time somebody gave him what he deserved. They flew back to Seattle that evening. Diana spent the flight reviewing testimony strategy and legal procedures. Evie spent it staring out the window at the landscape 30,000 feet below, thinking about her father tracking down Marcus, building his case piece by piece, giving her everything she needed to fight a war he knew was coming. Back at Willowbrook, Evie descended into the vault and pulled Rose's journal from where she'd left it. She'd been avoiding the later entries, the ones where her mother's handwriting got shakier and the dates got closer to the end. But tonight, she needed her mother's voice. September 2009. The diagnosis entry. Rose documenting the moment the doctor said pancreatic cancer, and 6 months in the same breath like they were synonyms. October 2009. Rose writing instructions for Robert. How to braid Evie's hair. Which songs to sing when nightmares came. The importance of letting their daughter choose her own path instead of forcing her into Robert's empire-building footsteps. November 2009. Rose getting weaker but writing longer, fighting against morphine and exhaustion to record everything she wanted Evie to know. Evelyn, my darling girl, if you're reading this, you're grown. You've made choices. Some will have been the right ones, some won't. Here's what I want you to understand. Your father builds with concrete and steel. I built with dirt and roots and patience. You have both of us in you, his determination and my ability to wait for beauty to emerge in its own time. Don't let anyone tell you who you're supposed to be. Don't become an engineer because your father wants you in the company. Don't become a gardener because I loved roses. Become whoever calls to your soul loudly enough that you can't ignore it. Evie read the passage 3 times. 4. The words rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own life. She'd gone into civil engineering because Robert loved building, had spent 4 years in college studying load calculations and structural integrity because it felt like honoring her father, had taken a job at a firm in Seattle designing bridges that would outlast everyone who drove across them, but she'd never loved it, had never felt the spark her mother described in entries about breeding roses, or the satisfaction Robert wrote about when foundations were poured perfectly level. What Evie loved was this: restoration, taking something broken and revealing the beauty underneath, preserving history, making old things new without destroying what made them matter. She sat at Robert's desk in the vault, surrounded by evidence of his meticulous planning, and understood that her father had given her more than money. He'd given her permission to become someone other than who she thought he wanted. The career she'd built was a monument to a man who was gone. Time to build something for the woman who was still here. Evie pulled out her phone and emailed her resignation to the engineering firm. Effective immediately, no 2 weeks' notice. No apologetic explanations, just done. Then she drafted a new business plan on paper Robert had left in the desk. Thornwood Heritage Restorations, partnering with Nate. focusing on historical properties that needed saving, turning inheritance into purpose. When she emerged from the vault, dawn was breaking and Nate was on the porch with coffee and a question about window placement that could wait but probably shouldn't. "I quit my job." The words came out before Evie had planned them. Nate didn't look surprised. "Good. You hated it. How did you know?" "Because you light up when we're talking about restoration and go dark when your phone rings with calls from Seattle." He handed her the coffee. "People who love their work don't look like they're being strangled by their own success. I want to do this, restore houses, preserve history, maybe partner with someone who knows what he's doing. I might know a guy." Nate's smile was sunrise breaking through clouds. "If you're serious." "I've never been more serious about anything." They shook hands on the porch of a house that was becoming whole again, and Evie felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly, but the kind of realignment that happens when bones that were set wrong finally get broken and reset properly. Kate's counterattack came through legal channels wrapped in concern and dripping with manufactured care. Diana called on a Monday morning with news that made Evie's hands go numb. "Kate filed for emergency conservatorship. Claims you're mentally unstable. She's using your sudden career change as evidence, arguing that you're making irrational decisions under the influence of grief." "On what grounds?" "Abandoning a stable career. Isolating yourself in a condemned building. Refusing reasonable offers to sell property." Diana's voice was tight with controlled anger. "She's got affidavits from people who've never met you claiming you're a danger to yourself and the estate. Can she do that?" "She can try." The hearing is December 18th. Judge will determine whether you need a court-appointed guardian to manage Robert's assets until you're deemed competent, which means Kate gets control of everything. "Exactly." Diana paused. "We need character witnesses, people who can testify to your stability and judgment. I've already contacted several, but I want you prepared for what's coming." The media found the story by Tuesday. Local news picked it up first. Heiress battle over million-dollar estate, then the regional outlets, then CNN ran a segment during their afternoon programming about wealthy families destroying themselves over inheritance. Reporters called Evie's phone 60 times a day. Camera crews parked at the end of Willowbrook Lane until Silas ran them off with his shotgun and creative threats about trespassing laws. TMZ ran a piece with photos of Jordan looking devastated outside the Thornwood estate, complete with quotes about family tragedy and legal warfare. Kate's lawyer gave interviews, painted Evie as unstable, impulsive, unable to handle the responsibility of wealth, painted Kate as the concerned stepmother trying to protect her deceased husband's legacy from a daughter too grief-stricken to make sound choices. The Maplewood Historical Society responded with a press release. "Evelyn Thornwood has shown exceptional dedication to preserving local heritage. Her work on the Blackwood Thornwood property demonstrates both fiscal responsibility and cultural awareness." Neighbors Evie had never met stopped by Willowbrook with casseroles in support. The woman who ran the general store in town organized a petition supporting the landmark designation. The pastor at the church Rose had attended 20 years ago offered to testify about the family's character. Nate's crew worked double shifts racing to make the house presentable before the hearing. Not perfect, just good enough to prove it wasn't condemned, wasn't dangerous, wasn't the liability Kate claimed. Jordan called Evie on Thursday night. His voice sounded hollow, scraped raw by something that might have been conscience finally waking up. "I contacted your lawyer, told her I'd testify. About the money laundering, the gambling, all of it. Mom's been using me since I was 19. Time somebody stopped her." "Why now?" "Because I finally saw the pictures. Of your dad. Of your mom. Of this house when it was whole." Jordan's breath shook. "You're not trying to destroy anything, Evie. You're trying to save something. I've spent my whole life helping Mom destroy things. I'm tired." The call ended with something that felt like truce, if not quite peace. Marcus Vale arrived in Seattle on Friday. Diana arranged a safe house protection in case Kate tried anything desperate. He looked nervous but determined, the way people look when they're about to do the right thing for the first time in years. The night before the hearing, Evie couldn't sleep. She wandered Willowbrook's rooms, watching moonlight stream through windows Nate's crew had uncovered. The house breathed differently now. Lighter. Like it remembered what it felt like to be loved. Nate found her in the kitchen around 2 in the morning. Brought coffee from the thermos he kept in his truck for nights when insomnia won. You should rest. Tomorrow's going to be brutal. Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see Kate's lawyers tearing apart everything Dad built. They sat on the counter because the kitchen table wouldn't arrive until next week, drank coffee that was too strong and too hot, and exactly what the moment needed. Your father left you weapons. Nate's voice cut through the dark. Truth, money, evidence. You're not defenseless. I feel defenseless. Fear is just information. It's telling you this matters. Listen to it, then act anyway. They sat in silence while the house settled around them and the future waited on the other side of sunrise. At 4 a.m., Evie walked to her mother's grave in the cemetery 3 miles away. Diana had offered to drive her, but Evie needed the walk, needed the cold, needed the space between Willowbrook and the place where Rose's body rested under marble that listed her as beloved wife and mother, like those were the only accomplishments that mattered. Evie knelt in frost-dead grass, traced her mother's name with fingers that had stopped shaking somewhere around mile 2. I'm fighting for what you and Dad built, Mom. Not the money, not the estate. The proof that 2 people can create something beautiful even when the world's trying to grind them down. Wind moved through the cemetery, carried the scent of evergreen from the forest beyond. I'm scared I'll lose. Scared Kate will win because she's meaner and richer and doesn't care about collateral damage. But I'm fighting anyway. Because you taught me that home isn't where you live. It's where you're brave enough to love, despite knowing you might lose everything. No answer came. Evie didn't expect one. She stood, brushed frost from her jeans, and walked back to Willowbrook as dawn broke cold and clear over Ravenswood. Silas was on the porch with coffee and his shotgun, and the kind of loyalty that didn't require explanations. Ready, no. But I'm going anyway. That's all that matters, girl. That's all that's ever mattered. The King County Courthouse stood against a December sky the color of old steel, all granite and glass, and the weight of 100 years of judgments that had changed lives without changing justice. Evie climbed the steps, in a suit Diana had insisted she buy conservative navy. Nothing flashy, the kind of armor women wore when they needed to be taken seriously by men who'd already decided they knew better. Camera crews lined the entrance. Reporters shouted questions that blurred together into white noise. Evie kept her eyes forward and her shoulders back the way her father had taught her to walk into rooms where people wanted to see her fail. The courtroom smelled like furniture polish and anxiety. Rows of wooden benches filled with spectators who'd come for theater for blood sport, disguised as legal procedure. Kate sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 4 lawyers in suits that cost more than Evie's car. Her blonde hair perfect, her expression composed into something that resembled grief if you didn't look close enough to see the calculation underneath. Jordan sat 3 rows back alone, wearing a suit that looked borrowed and a face that had learned what shame felt like. Diana settled beside Evie at the defense table, a single lawyer against Kate's army. But Diana's briefcase held weapons Kate didn't know existed, and that made all the difference between theater and war. Judge Marianne Caldwell entered, and the room stood. She was 62 and wore her gray hair cut short, no makeup, no jewelry, except a wedding band worn thin by decades. Her eyes swept the courtroom with the kind of assessment that came from 30 years of watching people lie under oath. Be seated. The rustle of 200 people sitting simultaneously sounded like wind through dead leaves. Richard Morrison stood for Kate's side, a shark in Armani, who'd built his reputation on destroying families and calling it estate planning. He opened with a summary of the will, presented it as clear and unambiguous, argued that Robert Thornwood's wishes should be honored exactly as written. My client, Mrs. Catherine Thornwood, has been exemplary in her grief and her patience. She has attempted multiple times to assist Miss Evelyn Thornwood in managing the burden of an inheritance she is clearly unprepared to handle. Morrison's voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone who'd weaponized compassion. But Miss Thornwood has rejected all reasonable offers, isolated herself in a structurally unsound property, and made impulsive financial decisions that suggest an inability to manage her own affairs, let alone a substantial estate. He called his first witness, a psychologist who'd never met Evie but had reviewed her pattern of behavior and found it consistent with acute grief disorder manifesting as poor judgment and risk-taking behavior. Diana cross-examined without standing. Doctor, you've never actually evaluated Miss Thornwood, correct? That's correct, but the documented pattern, so your entire assessment is based on second-hand information provided by whom? The witness hesitated. Mrs. Thornwood's legal team. And they paid you how much for this opinion? Objection. Morrison was on his feet. Sustained. Judge Caldwell's voice could cut diamonds. But I'll note for the record that expert testimony based entirely on opposing counsel's characterization carries limited weight. Morrison called Kate to the stand. She wore black Chanel and pearls and an expression of wounded dignity that probably played well to the back rows. She testified about loving Robert, about trying to build a relationship with his difficult daughter, about watching Evie spiral after the funeral. She abandoned a stable career. Kate's voice trembled just enough to sound sincere. She's living in a building the county condemned. She refuses all help, all guidance. I'm terrified she'll hurt herself or squander everything Robert worked for. Diana's cross-examination was surgical. Mrs. Morrison, you prefer Morrison to Thornwood, correct? Kate's composure flickered. That's my legal name. From your previous marriage, I've been married once. To Robert. We'll return to that. Diana pulled papers from her briefcase. You testified that you're concerned about Miss Thornwood squandering the estate. How much of the estate do you currently control? The assets left to me in the will, which include the Thornwood mansion on Lake Washington? Yes. Currently in foreclosure with a balloon payment of $15 million that became due. November 7th, Kate's lawyer objected. Judge Caldwell overruled. The property has temporary liquidity issues. Kate's voice went sharp. Nothing that affects my ability to. The bank granted you a 2-week grace period that expires in 3 days. Diana slid documents across to the judge. Have you secured financing to satisfy the debt? Kate's face went pale. I'm working with several. And the stock portfolio valued at $18 million. Have you attempted to liquidate any of those shares they're being held for? Because they're preferred shares in shell corporations with no assets, aren't they? Diana produced brokerage statements. My investigator found that every stock holding listed in Robert Thornwood's will is worthless. The corporations were dissolved between January and September of last year. Kate's hands gripped the witness stand. I don't know anything about. You've controlled Robert's financial affairs for the last 5 years. You expect this court to believe you didn't notice $18 million evaporating? Morrison objected again. The judge let it stand but told Diana to move along. Diana called Silas first. He took the stand in his cleanest flannel shirt and told the truth about Robert visiting Willowbrook every Thursday, about the maintenance payments, about watching Evie restore the property with skill and determination. That girl's got more sense in her little finger than most folks got in their whole body. Silas looked directly at Kate. She's building something real, not playing pretend with other people's money. Nate testified about the restoration work, about Evie's knowledge of historical preservation, about the business plan they'd drafted for Thornwood Heritage restorations. He brought blueprints and budgets and photographs showing Willowbrook's transformation from condemned to landmark quality. Morrison tried to paint Evie as impulsive. Nate shut him down with facts and numbers and the kind of quiet certainty that made lying impossible. Then Diana called Marcus Vale, and the temperature in the courtroom dropped 10 degrees. Kate's face went from composed to terrified in the space between heartbeats. She grabbed Morrison's arm, whispered something urgent. Morrison's expression shifted from confident to confused to something that might have been panic if lawyers allowed themselves such human reactions. Marcus walked to the stand wearing a suit that didn't fit quite right but made him look dignified anyway. He was sworn in. He sat. He looked at Kate with eyes that held no anger, just tired knowledge of exactly who she was. Diana started with the basics. Mr. Vale, how do you know Catherine Morrison? We're married. His voice was steady. June 15th, 2018. Chapel of the Bells in Las Vegas. The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell's gavel came down like gunfire. Order. This is not theater. One more outburst and I clear the gallery. Morrison was on his feet, papers scattering. Your Honor, this is clearly a fabrication. My client Diana handed the judge a certified marriage certificate. Also a notarized statement from the Clark County clerk confirming no divorce decree exists for Catherine Ashford and Marcus Vale. Kate stood without being recognized. That's a lie. He's lying. We were divorced in Mexico. Do you have documentation? It was the lawyer said he'd file. Kate's voice climbed into registers that shredded her careful composure. This is a setup. You paid him. You're all conspiring to Mrs. Morrison, sit down. Judge Caldwell's tone could freeze magma. Now. Kate sat. Her hands shook. The careful mask she'd maintained for 5 years had finally cracked wide enough to show the desperation underneath. Diana continued with Marcus. Did you ever sign divorce papers? Never saw any papers. She gave me $50,000 in December 2018 and told me to disappear. Said she'd handle the legalities. I assumed she forged whatever she needed. Why would you assume that? Because that's what Katie does. Marcus's expression held something like pity. She's real good at paperwork when it suits her, real good at making things look legitimate that aren't. Did you have any contact with her after that payment? Nothing until Robert Thornwood tracked me down last June, told me what she'd done, asked if I'd testify. I said yes. Why? Because your husband was a good man who got tangled up with someone who only knows how to take. Figured I owed him the truth even if I couldn't give it while he was alive. Morrison tried to discredit Marcus. Brought up his gambling history, his criminal record for petty fraud, the bankruptcy from 2016. Marcus owned all of it without flinching. I made mistakes, been paying for them ever since. But marrying Katie. That's not a mistake I'm lying about. The marriage is real and legal and she knows it. Diana let that sit for 5 seconds of silence that felt like hours. Then she introduced Robert's journal. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a personal journal kept by Robert Thornwood from January 2022 through October 2026. Diana held up the leather-bound book that Evie had found in the vault, the one Robert had filled with meticulous documentation of Kate's betrayals. Morrison objected. Hearsay. Unverified. The handwriting has been authenticated by 3 separate experts. Diana submitted their reports. And the contents are corroborated by bank records, emails, and witness testimony. Judge Caldwell examined the journal, flipped through pages covered in Robert's blocky handwriting. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. I'll allow it, but I'll read the relevant portions myself rather than have them performed for the gallery. She read silently for 20 minutes while the courtroom held its breath. Kate stared at the table. Jordan put his face in his hands. Evie watched the judge's face for any sign of what was coming. Finally, Caldwell looked up. There's an entry here dated October 1st, 2026, 1 week before Mr. Thornwood's death. She adjusted her reading glasses. I'm going to read this aloud because it directly addresses the matter before this court. She cleared her throat and began. If someone is reading this journal in court, then Kate has filed for conservatorship or some other legal maneuver to take what she thinks I left her. She's discovered the mansion is mortgaged, the stocks are worthless, the accounts are empty. She's desperate and dangerous, and probably blaming Evie for problems Kate created herself. Judge Caldwell paused, looked at Kate, continued reading. Here's what I need the court to understand. Catherine Morrison is a fraud. She married me while still legally married to Marcus Vale. She fed insider information to my competitors. She used her son to launder money through my businesses. She isolated me from my daughter and made the last years of my life a performance I had to maintain to protect what really mattered. I couldn't divorce her. The prenup she insisted on would have triggered a 50% asset split the moment I filed. She designed it that way, a trap that punished honesty and rewarded her continued presence. So I spent 4 years quietly moving everything of value somewhere she'd never think to look. I left her a mansion of debt and paper wealth that dissolved the moment anyone examined it closely. The judge's voice remained steady, but every word landed like a verdict. Evie is not unstable. She's not impulsive. She's exactly what I raised her to be: smart enough to see through lies and strong enough to fight for truth. The property on Willowbrook Lane isn't a burden. It's her inheritance, her fresh start, her chance to build something real instead of inheriting the hollow empire I created. Judge Caldwell looked up. The final paragraph is personal but relevant to this proceeding. Sweetheart, don't hate Kate. Pity her. She's so starved for gold she never learned to taste happiness. You have your mother's gift, the capacity to love even when loss threatens to destroy you. Don't lose that. Willowbrook represents what your mother and I learned together, that the only inheritance worth leaving is the kind that teaches you how to live, not just how to spend. The courtroom was silent except for someone crying in the back row. Judge Caldwell closed the journal and removed her glasses. Kate stood again, not waiting for permission. This is manipulation from beyond the grave. He was sick. He didn't know. He knew everything. Diana's voice cut clean. "He documented your insider trading with Hartfield Industries, your scheme with Montana Springs, Jordan's money laundering, Marcus Vale, all of it. Would you like me to present those files as well?" Kate's facade shattered completely, not with rage but with something raw, something that looked like a person realizing they'd built their entire life on foundations that were never solid. "I had nothing." Her voice broke. "Do you understand? I worked for 15 years clawing my way up from bankruptcy and fraud charges. I was brilliant and they still treated me like trash. I deserved something. You deserved honesty." Judge Caldwell's tone was granite. "You deserved to build a life on legitimate work. You chose fraud instead. You chose to use people. You chose to marry a good man under false pretenses and spend his final years extracting everything you could while giving nothing in return." Kate sank into her chair. All the fight drained out of her at once, leaving behind something that looked small and broken and almost human. The marriage between Catherine Morrison and Robert Thornwood is void ab initio due to her existing legal marriage to Marcus Vale. Judge Caldwell's pronouncement fell like a hammer. Therefore, the bequests to "my wife" in Robert Thornwood's will are null. Under Washington intestate succession law, the entire estate passes to the sole surviving child. She looked at Evie. "Miss Thornwood, you are hereby declared the sole beneficiary of your father's estate. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation. Fraud, bigamy, conspiracy, let them determine what charges are appropriate." Morrison tried to speak. The judge held up one hand. "We're done here." Bailiffs moved toward Kate as she sat frozen at the plaintiff's table. She looked at Evie once, and in that look was every emotion that greed had burned away. Fear, regret, something that might have been recognition that she'd destroyed her own life chasing someone else's. Then they took her away, and all that remained was the smell of expensive perfume and the sound of reporters stampeding toward the exits to file their stories. Jordan approached Evie in the hallway outside the courtroom. His eyes were red and his hands shook, but his voice was steady. "I gave the FBI everything. Bank records, wire transfers, contact information for everyone involved in the money laundering. They're offering me immunity if I testify against the others." Evie saw her father's accidental casualty standing in front of her, not Kate's weapon but a kid who'd been used since he was 19 and had finally figured out what love shouldn't cost. "What will you do after get clean? Really clean?" Jordan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Find work that doesn't involve stealing or lying or disappointing people who already decided I was worthless." "You're not worthless." The words surprised Evie as much as they surprised Jordan. "You're just lost. But lost people can find their way back if someone gives them a map. Why would you help me because someone has to break the cycle? Might as well be us." They didn't hug, didn't make promises neither could keep, just nodded at each other like soldiers who'd survived the same battle from different trenches and understood that survival was its own kind of victory. 1 year later, Willowbrook stood against an October sunset that painted the sky in colors Rose would have loved. The restoration was complete, not perfect, but honest. Victorian bones exposed and reinforced, windows that caught light and held it, gardens where roses bloomed in varieties Rose had dreamed of creating but never had time to finish. The grand opening of Thornwood Heritage Restorations fell on the anniversary of Robert's death, a choice Evie made deliberately. Celebration and remembrance woven together like the roses climbing new trellises Nate's crew had built. The Maplewood Historical Society brought a plaque designating Willowbrook as a protected landmark. The mayor gave a speech about preserving community history that ran too long but meant well. Neighbors Evie now knew by name brought food and stories and children who ran through gardens that had been designed for exactly this kind of chaos. Silas had set up tables in the yard, was regaling anyone who'd listen with tales of Edgar Blackwood and the original homestead. At 74 he moved slower, but his stories had only gotten better with age and repetition. Marcus Vale drove up in a modest sedan relocated to Seattle permanently, now working with Jordan at the community center they'd started together. He handed Evie a photo in a simple frame, Kate and him young and broke and getting married in Vegas before everything went wrong. "Figured you should have it. Not to remember her by, but to remember that people are complicated, even the ones who hurt us most. Where is she? Minimum security facility in Oregon." Marcus looked at the house, at the gardens, at the community gathered in celebration. "She sends letters sometimes. Not apologies. Just observations about what she lost. I think prison's given her time to understand the difference between taking and earning. Kate had been sentenced to 10 years for fraud and bigamy. Jordan's testimony and cooperation had kept him out of prison entirely, though he'd lost the dealerships and the Cabo house. The mansion on Lakeview had been sold at auction. Every piece of Kate's carefully constructed empire had been dismantled brick by brick. Jordan arrived with Mara, a woman he'd met at the community center where they both volunteered now. She worked with at-risk youth, believed in second chances, saw in Jordan what Evie had seen, someone worth saving. "We're getting married." Jordan showed Evie a ring that was modest but chosen with care. "Next spring. Here, if you'll let us, Mom and Dad would love that." Evie meant Rose and Robert, but Jordan understood she was claiming him as something other than enemy, as family by choice instead of marriage, as someone worth including in new traditions. The party swelled as afternoon turned to evening. Nate found Evie as the crowd peaked, handed her a glass of lemonade that tasted like summers from before everything went wrong. "Your father would be proud." Or would be. He gestured at Willowbrook, at the community filling every corner, at the business they'd built together. "My mother would love this garden." Evie looked at the roses, at the walking paths, at the small pond they'd finally built, according to Rose's 1999 plans. "They'd love that you're here, that you chose this." Evie slipped her hand into Nate's. They'd been engaged for 3 months now, planning a wedding for next summer. Nothing rushed, everything intentional. Building a life at the same careful pace they'd used to rebuild Willowbrook. Diana Whitmore arrived with her wife, brought news that the Thornwood Foundation, funded with $20 million from the vault, had awarded its first round of preservation grants. 12 historical properties across Washington would be saved because Robert had chosen truth over revenge, legacy over ego. As sunset deepened to twilight, Evie slipped away to the cemetery 3 miles down the road. She'd made this walk every month since the hearing needed the connection needed to tell her parents what they'd built was still growing. She knelt between 2 graves. Robert James Thornwood, Rose Margaret Thornwood. The marble had weathered a year of seasons, but the names remained clear. "I did it. Built something real from what you left me. Willowbrook's a home again. The business is helping other people save their histories. Jordan's found his way back. Even Kate. I think she's starting to understand what she lost." Wind moved through the cemetery, carried the scent of roses from Willowbrook's garden. "You taught me that what we inherit isn't houses or money, it's the courage to keep choosing love when fear offers easier paths, to build instead of destroy, to see value in things that don't shine." Evie stood, touched both headstones, walked back toward Willowbrook where lights burned in every window and music spilled into the October night. Nate was waiting on the porch, sitting in the swing Robert had built in 1998, the one that had survived rot and time and Kate's attempts to destroy everything it represented. "You okay?" "Better than okay." She sat beside him. The swing creaked but held their combined weight easily. They sat watching the last guests leave, watching Silas secure the property with the same care he'd shown for 40 years, watching the forest reclaim shadows from the day. Marcus approached before leaving, pulled Evie aside one last time. "Katie wrote something in her last letter. Thought you should know." He handed her an envelope. Evie recognized Kate's handwriting, the careful script she'd used to forge documents and construct lies. Inside was a single page. "Evelyn, I won't apologize. You know I'm not capable of that kind of honesty. But I will acknowledge what you already know. I destroyed my own life chasing something I convinced myself was wealth. Your father understood what I never could, that the things worth having are the things you build, not the things you take. You won. Not because you had better lawyers, or because Marcus testified, or because Robert planned so carefully. You won because you knew how to love something more than you loved winning. That's a skill I never learned. I hope Willowbrook becomes everything your parents wanted it to be. I hope you build a life there that I couldn't even imagine. I hope you prove that people like your father and mother, people who believe in love over gold, aren't fools. They're just braver than people like me. I won't write again. This isn't the beginning of redemption. It's just acknowledgement that I spent 52 years learning the wrong lessons, and it's too late to unlearn them now." Catherine Evie folded the letter. Didn't cry. Didn't rage. Just felt the weight of a woman finally understanding what she'd lost and knowing there was no path back to reclaim it. She went down to the vault one last time before bed. The space had been transformed into an archive for local history, the bins of cash long since distributed to preservation projects and scholarships. But Robert's desk remained the monitor's dark, the chair empty. Evie sat where her father had sat when he recorded his final message, where he'd planned and documented and built a foundation strong enough to outlast his own death. She pulled out the small cedar box she'd kept. Inside was Rose's engagement ring, the one Robert said to give to someone who loved her for her heart instead of her inheritance. Nate had proposed 3 months ago on this very porch, with no ring, just words and intention, and a promise to build something that mattered. Evie had said yes, had given him her mother's ring the next day, told him the story behind it, cried when he'd understood what it meant. She closed the box. Tomorrow they'd meet with the architect about the community center wing. Next week they'd break ground on their second restoration project in Tacoma. Next month they'd submit grant applications for historical properties in danger of demolition. The work would never stop. There would always be another house worth saving, another history worth preserving, another chance to prove that what you build with love outlasts what you buy with money. Evie climbed back up to find Nate already in bed, reading by lamplight. He looked up when she entered. "Find what you needed. Everything I was looking for." She climbed in beside him. He set down his book and wrapped an arm around her. They lay in the bedroom where Robert and Rose had once slept under the ceiling, where Rose had painted stars that Evie had restored to their original glow. Outside, Willowbrook settled into the kind of silence that comes from contentment instead of abandonment. The house breathed. The gardens grew. The foundation held. Evie closed her eyes and let sleep come, knowing that tomorrow would bring more work, more restoration, more chances to choose love over greed and purpose over profit. Her father had been right. The only treasure worth leaving was the kind that taught you how to live, not just how to spend. The kind that grew in other people's hearts long after you were gone. The kind that transformed rotting lumber into something beautiful, not through magic, but through the simple act of seeing value where others saw only waste. Willowbrook stood guard the way it had for 100 years. Through the Blackwoods and the Thornwoods, and now Evie and Nate. Through depression and war and cancer and Kate. Through every storm that tried to break it. Still standing, still solid, still home.